Hi, everyone. So, as I was so well introduced, my name is Marissa Rosenberg, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we're going to prepare humans to travel to space. So, I'm going to start off with telling you kind of where we're at now, what we currently do, and how the astronauts are affected. And then I'm going to talk about why that's such a problem and kind of some of the cutting edge techniques of how we can help them not be as affected by going into space. So this is a picture of the International Space Station. The part that the astronauts live in is the actual cylindrical kind of can-looking structure right in the middle there. It's about the size of a football field. The other structures are just there to hold up the solar panel. So it's actually a fairly small area, but it's so much bigger than something that we would be able to, say, send to Mars. What you can see here are the flags around are all of the international partners that go into funding and doing research at the International Space Station. So it's a huge, many countries that are working together, and that allows us to kind of build on each other and do things that we couldn't do alone. So this is a crew. This is a really great example. This is our crew that's on board right now. We have 2 women, 4 men, 2 Russians, a Canadian, German, and 2 Americans. And so it's a whole mix of international partners, different genders, and it's really a great demonstration of diversity. What you might also notice about this picture is they all have very puffy faces. And so this is one of the most obvious things that we see happening when you go into microgravity. And what happens is we don't really realize it, but just standing, gravity is pulling down a lot of fluid, not just blood, but other fluid in your body. And the second that goes away, all of that fluid just kind of floats right around your heart and your face, and it causes a puffy face and chicken legs. And I don't have a picture of their legs, but I can assure you they're pretty thin. What's interesting here is that you have this regulatory mechanism in your chest area that can tell if you have too much blood or too much liquid there. And that's basically just to help you regulate the amount of blood in your system. Your body has no idea that you went into zero gravity, and so it thinks that if you have X amount of blood here, you must have 3 times more down at your feet. And so your body just sheds all of that blood. And that's not a problem in space. Everything still works fine. The problem is when you come back to gravity and you stand up for the first time, all of that blood goes to your feet and there's not enough for your brain, and the astronauts actually pass out. And so that's a huge problem, although we've been working on some ways to help that, like compression garments that help keep the blood in the upper half of your body. Another thing that this fluid shift does is it actually creates a very high pressure in your brain. And one of the most delicate things in your head are your eyes. And so that increased pressure in your brain presses against the back of the eyes, and we're actually able to take images of the eyes in space and see that the eyeball is getting smushed from the back due to that increased pressure. And what we don't understand yet is how severe of a problem that is. So for now, we have short missions of 6 months. When we go to Mars, it'll be more like a year and a half. So if this goes untreated for a year and a half, could it end up, say, resulting in blindness? And that's kind of one of the open questions that we're not sure about yet. Another really big topic for NASA right now is something that we call behavioral health, more popularly known as psychology. We have the crew members report space stupids, and that's kind of a weird phrase, but they coined it. It's basically the idea that you're sluggish and you can't really function at as high of a cognitive rate as you're used to. They have decreased performance. They just feel like they're not sharp and on their A game. And that, we think, is probably due to chronic stress. If you can imagine, you're living, working 24 hours a day in a little pressurized can far away from Earth, that if a tiny micrometeoroid were to hit it, you're out in space. And that kind of chronic stress, the idea that like you can have an emergency at any second and have to go put out a fire, literally, that might make you have to jump in your space capsule and go back down to Earth, they're always on very high alert. So that's one of the big problems, and also chronic fatigue. It's so loud. It sounds like driving in a car with the windows down at 30 miles per hour, always. I don't know about the kilometers per hour, sorry. But it's very loud, you can imagine. And so they don't sleep very well. They sleep about 5 hours a night. And for 6 months, sleeping 5 hours a night, you just get extremely, extremely exhausted. Not to mention, there's a disrupted day-night cycle. We really rely on the sun to tell us when to be awake, and when it goes down, when to go to sleep. And they have a sunset and a sunrise every hour and a half. So they're just orbiting the Earth, and sunrise, hour and a half later, sunset. And so that's very disruptive to their ability to know what time of day it is. One of the more popular things that a lot of people know is that you lose muscle mass and bone density when you go into space. And that's fairly obvious. It takes a lot of muscle for me to just stand here against gravity, postural muscles that you don't use at all when you're floating. And we see the same kind of decrements in the muscle and bone in astronauts as we see to people who are bedridden for whatever reason. The good news with this is we actually have two great countermeasures for this effect. We have the T2 device, and that's the treadmill that you see. They're in zero gravity, so they use this kind of harness with different strengths of springs to be able to run. This device is actually called the Colbert, for any Colbert fans out there. And the one next to it that looks like a squat rack is called the ARED. It's an assistive resistance device. So it looks like a squat rack, but there's actually no weights involved because you're in zero gravity and it won't work. So what it is it's kind of like a clamshell device where you have tension and you use that to lift loads. And this can go up to 550 pounds. And so what we're having now is crew members coming back stronger than they were when they left. And so we're doing a great job. It's not quite as good with the postural muscles because you guys are all using your postural muscles now just to remain seated in a chair. And that kind of constant use, we can't recreate, even with these devices. They would have to be on them all day. And the bone is kind of the same story. We're doing an okay job, but it's not quite as good. So radiation, this is probably the number one concern for NASA. We have a list of risks. This is the reddest risk. This is the showstopper. And what you can see here is an image of Earth in the center, and those colorful bands are little pockets of radiation that are trapped from the sun and from other places in the galaxy. And they're trapped due to Earth's magnetic field, which protects us from all of that radiation. And the International Space Station orbits within that first little lobe. That's how close it is to Earth. It's really very near us. But it orbits within that first safe zone. And so we don't have to deal with any of the radiation, or not as much of the radiation. We do have crew members occasionally say they see flashing lights in their eye. That's actually radiation coming in and hitting their neuron. We get protected from most of that with our atmosphere, so they don't have the protection of the atmosphere, but they still have the magnetic fields. The second you go to the moon or anywhere outside of these Van Allen belts, you're going to get the full brunt of the universe's radiation. And that might be nothing. It's all probability. It might be that there's a solar storm and you get the acute effects of radiation poisoning, which is hair loss, vomiting, possibly even death. The longer-term effects are what we're really concerned about, though, and those are cataracts. You have incredibly increased risk of cataracts with radiation, cancer, including cardiovascular cancers and cardiovascular disease, and sterility. And you might have heard Elon Musk say this before, but definitely NASA is looking for older astronauts, like over 50, because it's very possible that from the radiation you can become sterile. And so they're thinking of sending kind of an older population that doesn't want to reproduce as the first people to go to Mars. Why this is such a big problem, if you think about it, though, is we can't really study it. I mean, in terms of testing, doing science, you would want to be able to irradiate humans, but that is not going to happen. It's not ethically correct, and it's very dangerous. Aside from that, we actually have a really hard time making space-like radiation on Earth. And so those two factors make it basically impossible. We can maybe study mice, but how much is that really going to translate, a mice to a human? It's a big gap. And so now NASA's really working hard to try and understand how we can even start to address this risk. And last, but definitely not least, is my field, and this is sensory motor changes. So sensory motor is kind of a complicated word for senses and movement. It's this image that you have in your head of where your body is in space. If you close your eye and you point to your toe, you can do it with incredible accuracy without looking. And that's because your brain has a model of how your body is built. And what we see in space is crew members, at least temporarily, are incredibly disoriented, dizzy, and very motion sick. But the good news about this is it only happens on certain short periods of the mission, and those periods are when they undergo a gravity transition. So let's say for a Mars mission, that would happen 4 times, as you can see here. When you go from Earth to space, so 1G to 0G, then to Martian G, then back to 0G, and then finally when you land on Earth, from 0G to 1G. And the risk increases during those periods, both because they're so disoriented and so motion sick, and I will show you examples of just how bad it is in a moment, but also the risk of the mission is really high there. That's the moment where you might have a fire upon landing, or your parachute may not open, or something really critical to the mission could happen. So the risks are very high during these periods, and to have crew members that are basically incapacitated is not going to work well for a Martian mission. So I'm going to share with you some pictures of the landing site. I'm fortunate enough to get to go out to the desert in Kazakhstan and actually test the astronauts in the field. So this is a picture of the last landing I went on. This is the Soyuz capsule. So right now, that's the only way humans go to space is on the Russian Soyuz. Lands in Kazakhstan. This is what they call their soft landing rockets. So they fire the rockets at the ground for a soft landing. I heard it's similar to a car crash. So much for that. What's great about this, though, is what you can see. You can kind of see the parachute there. That's where the capsule has fallen. Within 30 seconds, we have the first helicopter touching down. The helicopter is on the top of the image. There's another one coming in behind it. There will be 10 more after that will all land within about 3 to 5 minutes. And you see the cars on the left side of the image there racing to go to the capsule. And this is all Russian search and rescue, doctors, NASA people, depending on the mission, all sorts of people. But it's about 100 people that go out to the landing zone. And within 30 minutes, the search and rescue team has popped open the hatch, and we're helping the astronauts out. They get pulled out by 3 very strong Russian men. So I don't know how they're planning to do this on Mars, but right now it takes a whole village, literally, to get them out of the capsule. But I tell you this because there's 100 people going out and helping them get out. So we'll come back to that. But first I want to share some results of the test we do. So as you can see, the orange tent is the medical tent. That's where we do our testing. And the image on the right is my colleague. We go out there together, and that blue backpack that he's wearing is our lab in a backpack. It weighs about 70 pounds, and everything that we could need is in there. And we just pop it on one of the helicopters, they stuff us in the back, and we hop out as soon as we land and start testing them. So I'm going to show you what the crew members look like an hour after landing. So this is one of our best crew members, most stable. What you're going to see is he's going to stand up, he's going to walk towards a cone, turn around 180 degrees around the cone, and then he's going to have to step over an obstacle and sit back down. It's a pretty easy task. It takes him about 4 seconds before he went to space to complete this task. One other thing I really want you to watch out for here is when he turns the corner of the cone, he'll kind of stagger to the left at some point. We call that the hand of God. So that's basically when you see a crew member just walking fine, and then out of nowhere, it looks like someone came in and just swiped him. And so you'll see that here, and that's something that I actually try and recreate in virtual reality. So I'll show you that in a little bit. So you can watch the crew member here. He's in the blue pants in the center. We use those high-tech Converse space shoes. You'll see him walking around the corner here, and boom, he has to regain his balance after that stagger step. He's about to step over the obstacle, and watch him land on his own foot. And so one thing we hear from the crew members all the time is if they're not looking at their feet, they have no idea where their feet are in space. So what I told you, when you can point to your toe without looking, they cannot do that. It's such a bizarre concept. I'm pretty sure no one in the audience has ever had that experience of not knowing where your feet are. Even if they're asleep, you still can figure out where they are. So it's really something in that model is really breaking down. So the next crew member is going to attempt to do a tandem walk. So arms crossed, walking heel to toe. It might look like they're on a boat trying to do this. They are not. They're on stable ground. Again, this is just out in the desert. And it's interesting because we might be on the water soon. So I'll just let you watch this a few more seconds just to really understand what they look like. This is something that, even the administrator of NASA didn't realize until recently, until this study of us actually getting out there and testing them so early to landing. People didn't really realize. Maybe their doctors did because they were out there, and the crew members did. But it was a pretty tightly kept secret. But, in the future, we really need to know this. And so this is kind of being shared now as a real problem. And one of the biggest problems that are imminent is we're moving to water landings. So NASA is building the Orion capsule, lands in the water. Here's an egress test. Watch this person step over the hatch and slide down into the water. Is the crew member that I just showed you going to be able to do this? I don't think so. He didn't think so. SpaceX Dragon capsule landing in the water. Boeing Starliner going to land on land, but has some contingencies for the water. And so I'm telling you, these crew members are incapacitated, they're very motion sick, they're very off balance, and we're gonna put them in a little capsule bouncing around on the ocean without any view of the horizon for 2 hours. So that's gonna be really rough. But more importantly is when we go to Mars. There's still gonna be a team of doctors. We can load them up with motion sickness meds. They're not gonna be comfortable, but they'll be fine. They will not be fine here. So if we don't find a way to really prevent these things from happening, we're gonna have a really big problem when we actually get to Mars. So now the more fun part, what can we do? So these crew members are struggling. We have a few ideas, a few tricks up our sleeve. I'll kind of cover first virtual reality training. We have some motion-based training. We're actually able to simulate Mars gravity to a pretty high fidelity, and I'll show you some of that. And then some future technologies that are quite a bit further off. So this is our virtual Martian world. This is my personal research here, and that's me walking just in a perimeter. I'm walking on this medium density foam, think like a memory foam pillow. What it basically does is it makes your ankle information obsolete. So it's pretty hard to walk on, but I'm able to do it fine in normal virtual reality. What I'm going to show you next is my simulation of that hand of God. And so what the crew members say they experience is when they turn their head angularly, they feel like they're sliding to the left or the right. If they tilt their head down, they feel like they're zooming forward. And you can imagine that's quite nauseating and confusing. And so what I have done here, what I'll show you in a second, is used an old trick, which is a checkerboard, to elicit that feeling of linear motion. And it's triggered by head movements. So when I turn the corner and my head moves, you'll see a checkerboard kind of fly, and that makes me feel like I'm having that linear movement. So you can watch what it does to my walking here. You can see I lose my balance the first turn. I kind of stagger. I actually look quite a bit like the crew member there. You can see my walking. I'm not able to keep a normal pace. My steps become much wider, and you can see here, I lean out because you really feel as if you're linearly moving. And so what this is able to do is we can use this to train the astronauts. And I actually did a study recently where I gave them 4 days of training for 20 minutes each. I just put them in here, and I made them do that tandem walk 20 times. So for 20 minutes, they just tandem walked back and forth. And then I let them go on their way and had them come back 3 months later. And they were basically able to walk at the level of normal virtual reality without any of the disorientation. So this is a really powerful tool that we can use to start training them to not be as affected by the disorientation. I have some improvements to make for this, which should be very dangerous, I think, in a good way. So first is foveated rendering, and this is something that's big in the VR world now. People are talking about, you have eye trackers embedded in the VR headset that can see wherever you're focusing, and they render that higher, because that's how the eye works. Wherever you're focused is where you want the highest rendering, and the periphery doesn't really matter. What I want to do is have anywhere they're looking be a normal Martian scene and have that disorientation only in the periphery, so they'll never be able to focus on it, but it'll continue to make them feel like they're moving. And that's actually also how we sense motion with the eyes. The second thing I want to do is make 3D vection. So as you can see from the star field here, if we get rid of the checkerboard and bring in a star field, then we can have them feel that forward, back, as well as the left, right, up, and down. So these are going to be implemented pretty soon. Unfortunately, I wasn't ready to show them to you yet here, but hopefully soon. So here's our motion-based training. So this is a person just walking on a treadmill, and they see visual flow. To that person, all they can see is that hallway that they're walking down. And what you'll see in a second is then we start to move the platform that they're walking on, and then we can also move the visual scene. And so as you'll see here in a second, this gets very disorienting very quick. But the idea here is that you're able, if you can walk in a straight line doing this, then if you're disoriented later on, you'll be able to pull from this same skill set to be able to maintain your walking. So before you all get too disoriented out there, this is a very cool device. This is called Argos, and it's kind of like a robotic crane that can predict your movement, but it also offloads your weight. And so you can have moon gravity, you can have zero gravity. In this case, we have Martian gravity. And so you're able to jump extremely high, and it's in this huge kind of cage, 3D cage area, where you can walk around and practice doing whatever task in whatever gravity you want. And so in this case, I have a subject who has the disorienting virtual reality goggles on, and I'm just asking him to stand up from a simulated fall. Just stand up. It should take about 3 seconds for anyone to lie down on the ground to stand up. So this kind of simulates like if they were to just land on Mars and they have to get out somehow and they fall. And I'll just let you see. What I also think is really interesting is they start moving almost in slow motion. Just that lower gravity makes you move so much slower. This video is not slowed down at all. And you can see how much this person struggles just to stand. So it's really going to be a perfect storm of events, having this disorientation, as well as being out there by themselves with no support and a new gravity. So moving on to the far future, exoskeletons could be a really great way to help prevent the falls from disorientation. So usually exoskeletons are thought of as a way to help you be stronger, to lift something that you couldn't normally lift, something like that. But if you think about it, you could program it so that if you start leaning too far this way, the exoskeleton kicks in and actually corrects your balance. And so this is a multi-use tool, so I expect something like this would be great for Mars. But the real answer is a centrifuge, and a centrifuge is probably the most realistic way to have gravity. It doesn't have to be a centrifuge, but we need some sort of artificial gravity. All of the systems that I told you about, the bone, the muscle, the fluid shift, the heart, the eyes, and of course the inner ears and balance, all of those problems are simply solved by gravity. We evolved here on Earth. We evolved to see yellow light the best because our sun gives us the most yellow light. We evolved to use gravity in everything we do. And it's apparent when we go to space and we realize, oh, we were not meant to be here. And so we need some way to have artificial gravity. And it doesn't have to be any of these crazy contraptions that are giant and spin. It could just be something as simple as this small image, like a chair flipped on its side that spins. Just some way to pull the fluid back down to give your inner ears some sort of gravitational cue. So we don't have to think too big, too sci-fi, but I think you're going to be seeing a lot of talk of artificial gravity in the near future. And with that, I'd love to hear your questions, and feel free to ask me anything.